Okay, hello everybody. Hope everybody's having a good day. Today we're going to go into a topic about some of the issues that are being raised by the Democratic Party and the media in relation to slavery, reparations, the founding of America, and who's, I guess, responsible for it. We're going to look into a video that was done by a man named Trevor Noah, and what he says, we're gonna brief on this and go through what he says and take a quick listen to what he has to say about it.
You guys have any questions before we move on? Anything you want to chat about? No, we good? Yes, sir? That's an interesting question. What do you mean by that? If I...
Well, like, there are like white people that have like been disenfranchised like recently, like
recently is the key. Recently is the key.
Well, the country like deindustrialized, right? So like a lot of people in like manufacturing jobs and stuff, like
right.
Were affected.
But so to your question, I think you have to understand what the word reparations means first. So reparations, you are repairing something that you have broken. You are paying for something that you were supposed to pay for. I'm not saying that there aren't people living in America today who are suffering and are going through pain and strife because of what's happening when it comes to machines taking jobs, factories becoming industrialized, etc. But reparations is a specific conversation about a specific time in America, and that is black people were slaves. You know what I mean? I've even heard people say like, oh, but there were some of the Irish who were indentured. Like, yeah, let's slavery. Look at the numbers, look at the time, look at the level of work. You could not work toward your freedom. For most black people in America, this was a time when you lived and died as a slave. And so that's what reparations is about. And so I hear what you're saying, but I think that's a completely separate conversation that needs to be had about the now. Because if you are not careful, what you then do is you combine everybody's suffering into the same ball, and you make it seem like all injustices have the same weighting, and they don't. Just like crimes. You know, theft isn't the same as murder. We don't try them the same way. And as much as there is a white person who's suffering today, I feel for anybody who's suffering, because I know what it's like to be poor. I know what it's like to suffer. I didn't come from a wealthy family. We struggled when I was growing up. But I also understand that there are levels of that suffering, you know? And so sometimes white people, it does block a white person, because you go, white privilege. And the person goes, I'm poor and I'm white. Where's the privilege? You know, white people are like, I wish I could activate my white privilege. I wish I could do it right now. White privilege! Give me something. I get that.
Okay, so he says he gets that. Well, the problem with what he's saying is it's not true. Okay? America, if we're going to look in, we're going to focus blame, and we're going to go back in the past, we have to go back to where it starts. And going back to where it starts requires us to take a real look at serious fact to what took place. So what we're going to do is we're going to take a look at what is it, where does black slavery start? It's just I've been studying world culture and history now for over 40 years. When we look at the truth of where it starts, we find that black African slavery starts with the Islamic State founding. I mean, not to say it wasn't going on some before that, because there's evidence that shows that there were African tribes themselves of the same race, you want to call it a race, that they were enslaving their own people and forcing them into slavery. But as far as like black African slave trade happening around the world and then being exported and forced into slavery by a people, would have started with the Islamic States in 640 AD. The Islamic States and the founders of it invaded North Africa in 640 AD. After invading them, they enslaved the entire continent of North Africa and started the black slave trade. They were exporting slaves to China, Britain, England, France, all over the place. Anybody who wanted to purchase slaves could do so. When we look at racism, as it's being said, in the terms of black people, Muhammad of Islam is the father of racism. I've been studying, like I said, world history for over 40 years, and nowhere prior to Islam do I ever see a culture or an ideology or a tribe of people who had separated or divided people on the basis of their skin color until Islam comes along. the Prophet Muhammad himself seemed to not like black people. The Quran says, there's a verse in the Quran that says that the angel Gabriel came to him and warned him to tell all Muslims that they should know that should they come across a black man, his heart is more grosser than a donkey. Further, some of the very racial slurs we hear today were slurs that were made back 1400 years ago. Muhammad referred to Jamaicans as raisin heads. So, I mean, this guy really had an issue with black people. And then, too, like today, just real quick, a lot of black Americans today feel that they believe or have been led to believe that Islam was their founding ideology before they came to America. This, again, is a lie. It's a fact known that Islamic people are very disciplined to their way, their totalitarian rule. And under that totalitarian rule, it is illegal under Sharia law and by the Quran for anyone to enslave or sell as a slave a Muslim. So if the black Africans being sold by the Islamic states in that time were Muslims, they couldn't be sold as slaves. So the only people in that time that the Muslims could have been selling were tribal black African people, which in that time the majority of black African people were mostly either of their own tribal kind of ideology of belief, or they were Christian, or they were Jewish. Upon Islam invading North Africa, any one of those who were Christian, Jewish, or that of their tribal ideology was subject to being a slave, because Islam will enslave and feels they have the right to enslave anyone who is not a Muslim. But let's just take a quick brief at some history in relation to the Islamic invasion on North Africa and how it started.
I must admit that I too, among hundreds of millions of educated people, was under the impression that the African slave trade was the sole responsibility of the Christian Europeans, the white race. That is, until I started exploring the subject in greater depth, and especially after reading an incredibly enlightening book called The Legacy of Arab Islam in Africa by John Alambila Azuma. My whole perspective and understanding has changed dramatically, and I would like you to tell us more about this subject.
The success of Muhammadan Islam in deceiving, misinforming, deforming, and contorting both history and reality over a period of almost 1400 years has been astounding. That is, until now. The greatest tragedy about this particular subject is that most of the descendants of African slavery, the black people in the Americas, around the world, as well as among the African blacks, are totally ignorant of the actual facts. Before we lose the concentration of our listeners, I would like to make the following statement and then prove it. That the worst, most inhumane and most diabolical institution of the black African slave trade was initiated, refined, perpetrated, and implemented by the Mohammedan Arabs, and later aided and abetted by the black converts to Mohammedan Islam. I predict that, as usual, the two subcultures, those of denial of facts and of political correctness, will attack us without once disproving a single statement and or conclusion that we make. Slavery was not created by the white races, because it has existed throughout a human history and practiced by every tribe, culture, civilization, racial group, and religion. In fact, the very word slavery has its root in the name Slav, based upon the Slavic peoples of Europe who were subjugated by other Europeans. It is not common knowledge that the Arabic word abd is synonymous with the meaning of slave. For example, Abdullah means literally the slave of Allah, and that in the language of the Arabs, all black peoples are called abid, plural, for slaves. While much has been written concerning the transatlantic slave trade, surprisingly little attention has been paid to the Islamic slave trade across the Sahara, the Red Sea, and the Indian Ocean. While the European involvement in the African transatlantic slave trade to the Americas lasted for just over 3 centuries, the Arab involvement in the African slave trade has lasted 14 centuries, and in some parts of the Mohammedan world is still continuing to this day.
Okay. Well, as we can hear, now this guy is an African origin, as you can hear by his accent. He's not from America. He's a historian who has studied in-depthly about the history, of which I'm aware of because I've studied it in-depthly as well. Prior to, when we look back at actually where does slavery really take root, well, we see it throughout all of the last 10,000 years of American history. But we see of where we find a cultural authority of people enslaving another culture of people starts with Egypt and the Hebrew Jewish people. And then from there it progresses forward with many different other nations and rising of kings and pharaohs and many demigods and what have you, following pattern to what Egypt did and enslaving people all around the world. In this time, understand, not only were black Africans being enslaved, but as well the Islamic State felt they had the right to enslave anyone who was not a Muslim. This included many white Christians. And back in the time of over the 1400-year span of Islam, probably just as many white Christians were enslaved by the Islamic States as was black Africans. The issue, though, if you research Islam, you'll find that the value system to why blacks, Africans, became more popular as a slave than that of white slaves was because Muhammad had set the value of a white person as being, like I said, the man was a racist. He had set the value of a white person as being worth twice as much as that as a black person. This value system is well extended into slavery. So if you were looking for slave labor and you would go to the primary source of providing that, which would have been the Islamic States, if you wanted to buy slave labor and you were looking to buy white slaves, well, you would pay twice as much as you would for a black slave. So you could get as double the labor force of black slaves from the Islamic States as you could of a white slave, because you got 2 black slaves for the cost of what 1 white slave was. So people have to understand that this is the facts that, and where we have to actually start with wondering, where does this all start with the black Africans? It starts with the Islamic States in 640 AD and goes forward from there. When we look at the issues that are now taking place, of course this starts with the transatlantic and the founding of the continent of America, and that's what he's referencing. But this is where it actually really starts. And then even in the founding of the continent of America, we have to come to the realization of understanding that with Islam, you know, it was long-standing with Islam. They were trading at the time of when America was founded, you know, in like mid-1500s. At that time, Britain had already a large black African slave trade market going. Matter of fact, it was one of the leading industries in Britain at the time when the continent of America was founded. Britain was very inundated with slaves, and so was Asia, like in China area, with the black African slaves. And upon finding the continent of America was where, you know, it came about, like, you know, that the issues that took place as far as like with Britain and other nations to what they were doing, they were mimicking the Islamic State. The Islamic State during the time of back then were, as you can see here, this is a brief of just accounts of the wars and the progress of Islam in its attempt to take world authority. That's its goal, is to rule the world. These wars, this is a history of war all the way up until current times. As you can see, there's not a period of history that you can find that the Islamic States were not waging jihad on the world for world control and domination. This is a fact, you know. And like I was saying, when we look at Britain, we find out that Britain had massive trading in slaves, and at the time America was founded, we were under British rule. America at the time was being ruled by the British king, and we were establishing the colonies. And slavery was from the start something that the true Americans didn't want here, but really at the time we were under British rule and we had no choice. At the time of the development of the continent, between the first 150 years was under British rule up until 1776, where America claimed its independence. Prior to 1776, the British king had the ability to appoint governors. All the courts were ruled by him. And when we look back in history, and we look in, you hear black Americans saying, that they feel that it was white people and what have you. We have to look at the facts of a case that establishes the legal precedents for slavery in the new continent. And that case would involve back in 1670 with a man named Anthony Johnson. Now, Anthony Johnson, in his time, he was first, he was an indentured servant. Like most who came here and that were slaves, they came as indentured servants. They had a debt that they would have to pay for the travel and being able to come here and setting up quarters and what have you. People would agree that they would exchange for 7 years of their life to pay off their debt for whatever it cost for them to come here and live here while they were here and hopefully be able to have a little bit of money to establish themselves. Anthony Johnson was one who came as an indentured servant. He had done his time with a tobacco farmer in Virginia, and he was able to obtain his freedom. Upon obtaining his freedom, he himself filed a case because he had 3 slaves who ran away from him. And these slaves had gone into an area of America where they were kind of like against slavery, and they were appealing to the court for their freedom. Anthony Johnson had filed suit to take back his slaves. In this case, it was for 3 slaves. Anthony Johnson had argued that he had 2 of the slaves under indentured servant, and that he owned the 1 slave as a right, as property. And the court agreed with him. 2 of the indentured servants were sentenced to 3 more years of indenturement to him, to serve him. And the 3rd was sentenced, who was a black African, he was sentenced to a lifetime of servitude to Anthony Johnson, meaning Anthony Johnson would own him for the rest of his natural life as a slave. The ironic thing, like I say, is Anthony Johnson was a black man. Anthony Johnson went on to purchase large acreage in Virginia and start large plantations. And it is estimated that Anthony Johnson himself owned hundreds of black African slaves himself as a black man. Not only that, the other 2 people who were indentured servants to Anthony Johnson, just so you understand, they were both white. They were white indentured servants. And so understand, in the founding times of this, it was not just a white and a black issue in the new continent of America with the British king. You had many other of white as well as black indentured servants. Now, the transatlantic slave trade that we see that took place in the founding of our continent, while we were still under British rule at that time, we find out that, Britain had established in its time its governors here. And Virginia was one of the first settlement establishment of the British king, where he had set up governors, and slavery became very popular here because what he would do is he would send over his loyalists, those loyal to him that he would appoint as governors over areas in the Newfoundland. They would become the plantation owners. They would own the big plantations. Britain would import to them slaves to work these large plantations for tobacco and eventually cotton. And then he would make large amounts of money, 1 off of slave sales here, 2 off of the farming and horticultural that was being conducted by the labor of these slaves. But mind you, it wasn't Americans who were doing it. This was done under British rule, with British governors, British legislators, British courts. This was being done in this time before 1776 by Britain, not by Americans. Because even at that time, Americans were being subject to slavery, which we don't seem to want to talk about. But in the God's honest truth of the fact is that the Islamic State Muslims, like I say, they didn't discriminate. Anyone who wasn't a Muslim was subject to being a slave. So there was many Europeans, people like he mentions about, he tries to make sport of it that there was just a few, but I got news for you. It was millions and millions of white people who were captive by the Islamic states and put into slavery and sold as slaves in trade markets. Over the 1400 years, millions and millions, possibly of what research now shows, near either equal or probably greater than that of what was traded in African slaves. So these are things that you have to understand. This is not so much an issue of white and black as it is just an issue of totalitarian regimes who wish to enslave people. And everybody was subject to being a slave. It was not just a black African issue. Everybody in the world in those times was subject to being a slave. If you didn't have the ability to fight off the oppressor, you were going to be a slave. Now, the majority of slave trade and things that took place in the new continent of America as it was developing was being done under the British authority, under the British appointed authority in the new continent. Like I have here that we're looking at is pretty much the colony of Virginia, which if you notice, you can see that it has the British flag, the coat of arms, and this is really what it was like. You know, this existed this way all the way up until the Revolutionary War took place under the British rule. And these were the people who were running the slaves around and growing the plantations and controlling the plantations were the British loyalists. These loyalists, during the time of when we get to the point of the Declaration of Independence, we find that the loyalists, you know, we know of the Civil War in the time of where we have, you know, the Civil War in the 1860s, but most people aren't aware that we had a Civil War during the Revolutionary War at the same time. That Civil War, upon us filing our Declaration of Independence, we had to contend with those who were the massive slave and plantation owners in the South. The loyalists to Britain, the British appointed by him, were the wealthiest people in America and the largest of the slave owners in America, and they owned the biggest plantations in America. Even before the foundings, Thomas Jefferson himself was always opposed, as well as the majority of true Americans in the colonies. They were very opposed in the original 13 colonies to slavery. They didn't want slavery. And most people aren't aware that, you know, we as Americans in the founding of this country, we were fleeing totalitarianism, no different than that of what the black Africans were trying and wanting to flee, because, mind you, like I say, black Africans were slaves for 1,200 years under the Islamic rule before America was even founded. These people were being sold by the Islamic Muslims and that of their own tribal kings. Their own tribal kings, if you research Islam, you'll find back in 640 AD and forward, the only black Africans who were allowed to become Muslim were the tribal leaders. And that was so that the Islamic State could control them. But the tribal people themselves, they weren't Muslims. They were either practicing the ideology of their tribe, or they were practicing Judaism or Christianity. They were not Muslims. And the reason that this is a fact is also a fact with history and records, as it shows. They could not sell them if they were Muslims. It's against Sharia law of the Islamic culture. It's against the Quran as well. It's forbidden for them to sell a Muslim as a slave. So all that when they went in and they raided and they gathered all these slaves up, these were tribal, innocent tribal black African people who were just either tribal ideology, Christians, or Jews. And then they were put on ships, shipped to Britain. Britain shipped them to America to labor the farms and the plantations for the British authority that Britain had. When we get to the point where we see that America, after claiming its independence, we find out that we had big major issues with what was known as the British loyalists. Of course, because these people were totalitarian in nature, just like their king of Britain. They were set up pretty well. They were the wealthiest people in this continent. They had the biggest plantations in this continent. They didn't have to work because they had slave labor doing the work for them. And, you know, they were loyal to the King of Britain. They liked their life. They liked to just sit back and let everybody do everything for them. These loyalists, eventually in time, would become enemies to America. And we would have to endure, at the same time of the Revolutionary War, we would have to endure that of a civil war taking place with these loyalists. These loyalists did not want to give up their plantations. They didn't want to give up their slaves. They didn't want to side with the patriots of Americans, so they fought against us. I'm pretty sure, I think some of the older, maybe, I don't know what they teach now in history. Obviously, they don't teach anything anymore in school because nobody seems to be aware of these facts. But the Loyalists, at the time, they were so hated by the true Americans that, you know, when we found them, they were tarred and feathered, hung, and executed because they were treasonous people against the American patriots who were fighting for their independence. We see that in the time of the Loyalists, it was estimated almost 80,000 of the Loyalists fled America. A large majority of them went back to Britain and resettled back then, and many of them took their slaves with them back to Britain, and some of them fled into Canada and left their plantations and slaves behind. If you research history, you'll find that there was a period that after the Revolutionary War took place, you're going to find that there was a period where, you know, during that time, Britain had told the slaves that were under their rule of their governors and their appointed plantation leaders that if they fought with the Loyalists, they would earn their freedom. Well, this didn't turn out good either for the black African, because at the end of the war, when the Patriot Americans won this war, Britain reneged, and many, as the Britain and the Loyalists were fleeing America, the claimed the Africans at the time that fought with them were looking to be free too, and they want to leave. And there's letters and there's evidence in the archives that show of things that were found of the black Africans who were slaves, who fought for the Loyalists and were supposed to obtain their freedom, wound up being left behind. And there's stories about some, that this is in the archives, this is a fact, that when the British ships arrived to take some of the Loyalists out, or they were leaving on ships to get out, the black Africans tried to swim to the ships. And upon approaching the ships, the Loyalists would swing at them with swords and cut their arms and stop them from getting on the ships and leave them to drown. So many of them realized that they weren't really going to get their freedom. As well, many of those who did get to return to British control, like Britain and Spain, upon going there, wound up just being retaken and put back into the British slave trade and resold again as slaves back into slavery. So understand, you know, they fought for loyalty, believing they were going to get their freedom, but they didn't. Another thing that it seems most don't seem to realize, you know, when you ask people here, when did slavery end? Most go up to 1860s, when we went into the second, what I call the second, because our first Civil War was actually with the Loyalists of Britain. Our second Civil War, which we fought with the Democratic Confederate slave states. We're going to touch on that in a minute, but just so you understand that in the time of when this was taking place, and then you had slavery, now we beat Britain, and now we're establishing our own nation. In the time of establishing our own nation, we have many things to contend with, because also not only was the Loyalist slave owners, and most will be shocked by this, but as well, we find out the American Indians were as well slave owners, which we're going to watch a little bit of a clip here and take a listen to this here. This is a story that was done by a black American man who had stumbled upon these a while back, and he was sharing, and he did a small documentary on it. So we're just going to listen to his documentary.
Hello everyone, I'm Sam Ford. Earlier this month in our 7 Inside Reports, I took a personal journey to look at a largely unknown chapter of black history when my ancestors and thousands of other blacks were slaves, not of the whites, but of the Indians. Well, a lot of people responded who'd missed some of the segments and who wanted to know more about the subject. So today you'll see it all and more, and get your pencils. At the end we'll have not a test, but an address and phone number where you can get more information. Every summer at Tahlequah, Oklahoma, the Cherokee Indians sponsor their Trail of Tears pageant, the story of how the U.S. government robbed the so-called 5 civilized tribes of their homelands in the South and moved them by force to Oklahoma. They don't tell about the thousands of blacks the tribes brought with them, their slaves.
My mammy and pappy belonged to a part Cherokee named W.P. Thompson when I was born.
The woman reading is my sister, Elaine Ford Staton, but the words are those of our great-grandmother, Phyllis Thompson Pettit, whose Georgia-born parents were brought by the Cherokees over the trail. Johnson Thompson was Phyllis's brother.
Before that, Pappy had been owned by 3 different masters. One was the rich Joe Van, who lived down at Weber's Fall, and another was Chief Lowry of the Cherokees.
My cousin, Maurice Shepard, reading the words of his great-grandfather. The interviews were conducted 52 years ago here at Fort Gibson, Oklahoma, when both my great-grandmother, Phyllis Pettit, and her brother, Johnson Thompson, were in their 80s, part of a federal writers project. Now, both of them are buried in this cemetery. But after I read their words, I was set on a mission to find out how my family became slaves of the Indians. I learned that beginning with the administration of George Washington, it was the policy of the U.S. government to civilize the Indians by teaching them modern farming techniques.
To adopt agricultural practices that patterned after the whites, and one of those in the South was slave trade.
I don't ever talk about it very much because I think it's a very shameful part of Cherokee history, and so I've purposely avoided involving myself in that whole issue.
While the current chief may be ashamed, at the Cherokee Museum today are slave bills of sale, including one for 3 slaves bought in 1841 by then Principal Chief John Ross. The chief and his brother Lewis were among the biggest slaveholders in the tribe. Indeed, many of my mother, Kathleen's ancestors, the Rosses, were owned by the chief's family.
They were Southerners. They adopted Southern institutions, Southern dress, Southern black slavery.
But one characteristic they did not like was Southern greed for their land. By 1830, through wars and treaties, the 5 tribes had lost most of it. Then they were all ordered to move west to Oklahoma. 4 of the tribes left, but the Cherokees took their case to the U.S. Supreme Court and won. At least they won the lawsuit. Then the man on the $20 bill stepped in.
And President Jackson essentially told the Supreme Court, you know, you made your ruling in favor of the Cherokees, now, you know, try to enforce it.
As president, Andrew Jackson controlled the army, so 14,000 Cherokees and 1,600 slaves were herded to Oklahoma, some groups in winter, with about a quarter of the Indians and blacks dying along the way.
You got plenty of Indians right today don't like Andrew Jackson in this area.
84-year-old Luther Scales, who describes himself as 1/4 black and 3/4 Indian, is president of the Coweta, Oklahoma Historical Society. He remembers stories his Creek Indian grandfather told him about the removal, which was devastating for the Creeks as well.
He said the roughest part of it was crossing the Mississippi River in a boat.
How so?
Well, man, the Mississippi River, do you know down there in Arkansas and Mississippi, when you're talking about a mile across, mile or so across the river. And then in a boat, as swift as that water running, well, you got problems.
Once in Oklahoma, the slaves were put to work, raising cotton, building the new nations. The Merle home, which still stands outside Tahlequah, Oklahoma, was built by the Cherokees' black slaves. And should you think the Indians were much kinder masters than the whites, listen to Granny Phyllis's words in the interview about my great-grandfather.
My husband was George Pettit. He told me his mammy was sold away from him when he was a little boy. He looked down a long lane after her just as long as he could see her and cried after her. He went down to the big road and sat down by his mammy's barefoot tracks in the sand and sat there until it got dark, and then he come on back to the quarters.
Oklahomans reenacting the Civil War Battle of Honey Springs. When it actually occurred, this was the Creek Nation in Indian Territory, slave territory, in which all of the 5 civilized tribes had signed treaties supporting the South. And the battle actually looked much like something out of the movie Glory, except it wasn't the 54th Massachusetts, but the 1st Kansas Colored Regiment that saved the day. Because of fear of attacks from nearby Kansas, many Indian slave owners fled south.
I can just remember when Master John Harnish took us to Texas. We went in a covered wagon with oxen and camped out all along the way.
My sister, Elaine Ford Staton, reading the words of our great-grandmother, Phyllis Pettit, a girl at the time of the war. In ex-slave interviews conducted by federal workers during the Depression, she told how her brother, Johnson Thompson, and her parents were sold from one Cherokee master to another and taken to Texas.
And Pappy done the driving of the oxen. I was set in a wagon and listened to him pop his whip and holler.
On the square of the old Cherokee capital in Tahlequah, Oklahoma, stands a monument to Cherokee Confederate war dead. But the war here was confusing. While Cherokee Chief John Ross was arrested by the Union Army and shipped to D.C., his mansion was burned to the ground by Cherokee Confederate General Stan Wadey, who just didn't like the chief. And while Creek Chief Samuel Chakotay fought for the South, Apathalea-Hola, another Creek chief, fought for the Unions, his slaves at his side. In any event, when the war was over, the tribes who'd all signed Confederate treaties were in trouble.
The United States government informed the 5 civilized tribes that all previous treaties are null and void. And the first thing to be accomplished is to sign a peace treaty.
The new treaties meant the Indians lost more land. And since this wasn't legally considered the United States, Abraham Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation had not covered Indian slaves, so the treaty said they had to be freed.
One of the things the federal government required in those treaties was that these tribes adopt the blacks as equal members of the tribe, their former slaves.
One day, old Master stayed after he ate breakfast, and when us Negroes come in to eat, he said, "After today, I ain't your master anymore. You all as free as I am." We just stand and look and don't know what to say about it.
The words of her brother, Johnson Thompson, read by his great-grandson, Maurice Shepard.
Pappy wanted to go back to his mother when the war was over and the slaves were freed. He made a deal with Dave Mounts, a white man who was moving into the Indian country, to drive for him.
Granny Phyllis described a harrowing trip in which they had to fight off wolves with fire from their camp. A wagon journey over land and water that lasted 5 weeks.
When we would come to a river, we would cross boats. But me and brother rode on a bed in the back of the wagon, and when we were crossing the river, Father would make us lie down and wouldn't let us look out. He was afraid we would fall out in the river.
Finally, they arrived back to Fort Gibson in northeastern Oklahoma, where their father's mother was working as a cook for the U.S. soldiers.
My grandma, Phyllis Harnish, was the mother of the Colored Baptist Church on 4 Mile Branch, east of Fort Gibson. She organized the church and was head of it as long as she lived.
Since the Cherokee tribe owned all the land, as new Cherokee citizens, the family merely picked a spot. After Granny Phyllis Pettit married, her first child was my grandmother, Lutetia, whose third child was my dad, Sammy.
Well, so this is an interesting part of history it seems most people aren't aware of. And when we look at this, we have to understand where it really all starts to take place. When you understand at this time, during the independence of when America was forming, we had a division among this country. Many of the loyalists after the Revolutionary War was won had come back to America. They had gone back to the South. They had filed lawsuits with the court wanting their lands back. As well, the southern states were fighting for the right of states' rights to keep their slaves. The northern colonies of the true Americans didn't agree with this. They wanted to abolish slavery. Most aren't aware of how, like if I was to ask somebody when was slavery abolished, most of them would want to say, oh, that happened during the Civil War. Well, in truth, the reason that most of the loyalists had fled to the South and the nation started to divide was because the original 13 colonies of the founders, the true Americans who had fought that independence war, of which they say at the time it was 3% of the population of the nation. The loyalists made up, like I said, it was 80,000 estimated that fled the country, and somewhere estimated total population of them somewhere around probably 600 to 800,000, near 1 million of them, and many of them were still in the South, and they still ran their plantations, and they still had their slaves. They didn't want to give them up. when we think of the Civil War, we think of the Civil War as the time when slavery ended. But the truth of the matter is that slavery, actually, upon winning the Revolutionary War, was starting to be abolished, with the first state to abolish slavery in 1777, the state of Vermont. Following Vermont was the rest of the 13 colonies as things progressed. These movements today, a lot of black Americans, that I know that are ignorant to this history, they raise the issue of, oh my God, it took like 80 years until the Civil War, and and like I said, and I've said this before in comments and things, that people seem, some with common sense get it, and others are still, there's just no hope for some people, but what can you do? But understand, in that time, when let's say for instance, like you get to the point of the Civil War, and you have Jefferson Davis of the Democratic Confederate Slave States of the Democratic Party in the South. You got Abraham Lincoln, the Republican of the Republican Party of the true Americans in the United States in the North. Okay, and Lincoln wants to get Davis a letter. It isn't like today. There was no internet, there was no telephone, there was no airplanes, there was no vehicles. Everything was on horseback back then. Okay, so for him to get a letter from Washington down to Georgia could take a year, 14 months on horseback for that guy to get that letter. And then when he gets there, it's going to take time for him to give that letter to Jefferson Davis. Then Davis meets with his slave-loving people who don't want to give up their slaves in the Democratic Party. And then they write their own response. And then now we're looking at another, possibly anywhere, depending on what season it was. If it was springtime, the ride could probably be a lot easier. If it was wintertime and it was heavy snow or what have you, that trip could take 12, 14 months, 16 months, 18 months. So it could take a period just to get one comment back and forth in that time. Could take anywhere from a year and a half to 3 years. So understand, things moved at that pace at that time. Trying to negotiate things, and the South were very aware. The Southern Democrats of the Democratic Party were very aware that in the northern states they were abolishing slavery. As we look over, and if you really take a close look at history, you'll find that, in time, we became divided as the nation leading up to the Civil War. In that division, we had what was known as the Northern Free States, and they called it the Mason-Dixon line. And then you had the Southern slave states of the Democrats. And the North was the true Republic of the United States, and we were dividing. Most people don't seem to understand that this divide was building since the time of when Vermont in 1777 abolished slavery, and slavery was being abolished in the northern colonies. The Democrats, who formed the Democratic Party in 1828, these Democrats, when you say, well, who are these Democrats? These Democrats are the remainders of the democracy of Britain. They're the loyalists that stayed behind, kept their plantations and kept their slaves. They didn't want to give up their slaves. Matter of fact, they had grand plans to go ahead and expand slavery out to the west. They were, again, already, before the Civil War even broke out, which we knew, there was a ban on the importation of slaves that was done by the northern colonists back in early 1800. They banned that no more slaves could be imported into the United States. This ban in the early 1800s caused issues as well. Our first war as an independent nation was no other than with the very slave providers, the Islamic states. We had our first war of what was, everybody refers, they use these names to try and cover who's involved. Like the Democrats try to devolve North and South to try and eliminate that it was really Republicans, Democrats. The same applies here. They call them the Barbary Pirates. But in truth, the Barbary Pirates were the Islamic states. They were the same Islamic states that had been dealing in black African slave trade for now over near 1,200 years at the time. And slavery was still very, very much going on, and white slaves were very much in demand. So in 1801, we had our first war as an independent nation. We didn't have a navy at the time. We didn't really have much of a military left after the Revolutionary War, and we were struggling. And they had started to, Britain was paying what they call a jizya tax to non-Muslim countries. if you wanted protection from the Muslims not enslaving your people, you had to pay them like a ransom. They were like the mafia of the world. You know, you pay us or you get enslaved. So, you know, Britain prior, when we were under British rule, we were protected in our travels because Britain paid the jizya. Now, as an independent nation, we would be required or demanded from us by the Islamic states that we pay the jizya. And we had to pay the jizya at first under George Washington because we didn't have a navy. We had no means of anything to fight them. We were already pretty much diminished by the Revolutionary War. And they had started capturing our ships abroad and enslaving the white Americans or black Americans, whoever was on the ship. If they weren't a Muslim, they got enslaved. They were put into the slave market, and they would offer up a ransom to us, and either we pay the ransom to get them back or they sell them off into slavery. So again, understand, this was not even then a white or black issue. It was, again, if you didn't have the military might to defend your people, you were going to be a slave. Because, like I say, if you look at the Islamic states, long train of history here in relation to the wars with them and their campaigns on humanity. This is a list of the wars that, you know, of their jihads around the world throughout history from the time they founded up until today. And as you can see, their goal is totalitarian rule over the world. Okay, and in this very day, the sickening thing is, in this very day, right now, at this very time, in the Islamic states, it is legal under Sharia law to have slavery, and they still have open slave trade markets where they deal in both that of black African slaves, for the majority, sadly, still to this day, and as well white Christian slaves. And anybody that's not a Muslim that they capture in a war with a small area that they overthrow, under Islamic Sharia law of the foreign nation of Islam, and their Islamic states, it's legal for them to enslave those people and put them into the slave market and buy and sell and trade them as slaves. White, black, African, doesn't matter. There's still a massive move by the Islamic states on South Africa in this very day right now, and where, because a large area of South Africa is Christian, and those Christians in Africa, being, even though they're black, it doesn't matter, black or white, it doesn't matter, being they're Christians, the Islamic State feels they have the authority and right. They can go in and raid these places, take these people and ship them into like Lebanon or Arabia and put them into slave markets and sell them as slaves. I'm not talking like back in the ancient time where we're on topic. I'm talking this very day, right now. Slaves are being bought and sold right now, in this very day, in Arabia, Iran, Lebanon, anywhere that the Islamic State authority of Sharia law is, there is slavery in this very day. There are videos you can look on YouTube, it's right now, of slaves out of Libya, Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, Africa, South Africa, Nigeria area that escaped slavery just like 3 years ago, and they're out now, and they sought asylum, and now they're telling their stories about when they were slaves. And this is today, like today, now. So we've got black Americans, you're raising issues about things that happen, and you're blaming and pointing the finger at America. My problem is this: if you want to point the finger at somebody, point the finger at the ones who are responsible for slavery, and take into account the truth of fact that, you know, you say you want reparations. I have to ask you, who is going to give reparations to all the white Americans who fought to free the black Americans? Do you realize how many hundreds of thousands of men died to free black people, as well black people in that time, fighting for their freedom? When you read stories about the men and the women and the families and the people of the Americans in the time of the Civil War who fought for their independence and freedom, there are stories of black patriots who were shot, wounded, would not allow that American flag to touch the ground, because that's how loyal they were to freedom. You make this out as you want reparations because this is what the Democratic Party is pushing on you. And with the Democratic Party, this is the majority right now, many black Americans are members to the Democrat. This baffles me to this day. Why you would be a Democrat. Because the Democratic Party was the Democratic Confederate slave states. They fought to establish and keep slavery. They fought for the right to be able to expand it. As a matter of fact, they divided from the United States, literally formed their own democracy under the Confederate Democratic slave states, drafted their own constitution, which in their own constitution, they made it illegal to abolish slavery. This is a fact. Jefferson Davis wrote his book while he was in prison as a traitor for 2 years, The Rise and Fall of the Confederacy. In his book, he talks about, and then too, not to mention, if you look at every declaration of seceding from the Union by the southern states that succeeded, the primary cause within the first chapter was because the North was abolishing slavery. Now, I understand you want to make this about race, but this is about humanity. Understand, America is 242 years new. Okay? New. That's all we've been. 242 years. It took 80 years till the Civil War to free the black Americans and end slavery here in America. Like I say, you could say 80 years. Well, you know, remember the comment about the horse ride. Okay? Things didn't happen. And then not to mention, too, understand, in the North, we had many of what was known as Dixiecrats. And they were still in favor and loyal to the South. In contemplating a civil war, we had to figure how many are we going to have to fight right here in our own states that are free states. Because you had them playing the same role as what they do right now in this very day. They were in the North. And in the North, you know, like I say, you don't realize in Virginia and in other states that under state rights, there were still many black slave owners who were in agreement with the South to keep slavery because they had many black slaves as well working their plantations, their tobacco farms, which eventually got dissolved by Britain itself before this, you know, with the British rule when they had Britain had come into Virginia and took away all the blacks and made everybody who was black. It was Britain who declared that anyone who was a black African was a slave, not the Americans. You can look this up. You can see it. It's a fact of history. Britain came in when Virginia, in the Virginia colonies, they had the governor of Virginia was loyal to the British king. There were their people placed by British. And when they realized that blacks were rising up and owning plantations and building large wealth, that was the British king came in and said, no, you can't do this, and then declared that if they're of African descent, every African is a slave. And they stripped them. This is why many of them fled to the free colony states areas where slavery was not so prevalent, and they could you know, otherwise if they stayed, they were going to be captured and made a slave. And even the ones that were free. When British in Britain in like the early 1700s, are leading up actually to the early 1800s, right before the Revolutionary War, they had took away free slaves' rights, the British. So you know, the only place they could run now was to the areas that would protect them. The thing you're missing is this is not a race issue because the place they ran to were white people. Okay? You're making this all out to be because the Democrats. This is what the Democrats want to do. They want people to believe that this is a white and black issue when it's not. It's an ideology issue. It's those of an elitist status who believe that some reason they're entitled to rule over other people and enslave people. These are who the Democrats were. Again, Jefferson Davis was the first Democratic president of the Confederate Democratic slave states. Abraham Lincoln was the first Republican president of the Republican North United States of America. The United States of America does not owe anybody anything when it comes to slavery because it was the United States of America that abolished slavery, ended slavery in the Civil War, and tried to do all it could to make equality here in America. The problem with equality in America, to why we're so divided, though, again, comes from the Democratic Party. When we look following the time of the Civil War, as what I have up right now, what is up here right now, is the Jim Crow laws. Okay, the Democratic Party had formed the Ku Klux Klan, these people were to suppress the blacks now that they were free after the Civil War. Following the Civil War, we have the we have here, like the equal rights of the you know, we go back, we're going to start here with the 13th Amendment, which was established to give the right of citizenship. We had the 13th Amendment here that abolishes slavery, if you can see that. I'm just trying to, you know, I'm no pro at this stuff here. But this is the 13th Amendment abolishes slavery. Now, in this, how many Democrats were in favor of this? Not a one. Not a one. Matter of fact, the whole entire division of the Civil War by the Democratic Confederate States was to retain slavery. The 13th Amendment abolishes slavery. Now, when we go over and we get to the 14th Amendment, which grants citizenship, okay, these things were all put through the House by the Republicans. The Republicans wanted, under the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment, we granted the abolishment of slavery, the right of citizenship, equal protection of the law, and as well the right to vote. None of those amendments to our Constitution were supported by the Democratic Party. All of them opposed it 100%. You can look at the voting record and see this for a fact. So the biggest mistake America made was, following the Civil War, most of the Democrats were considered traitors to this nation, because that's what they were. They were traitors. They sided with the division. They wanted to form a democracy and overthrow the Republic of the Free United States. So understand that, and then following the Civil War, they still pursued this goal. This is when they formed the Ku Klux Klan, enacted the Jim Crow laws, did everything they could to try and infringe upon black people embracing their liberty, freedom, and rights. Now, we get to the point where things get up to, like, you know, more modern times. It gets into where we get into modern times, like the 1965 Civil Rights Movement. All the way up until this point, the suppression of those rights was mainly done by the Democrats. Like I say, the Jim Crow laws, the Ku Klux Klan, anything they could do. You know, when we look and we see, like, I'm gonna go back here just to show you that in 1865. Now you see, this is where the Klan is established. This is following the Civil War. And this, you know, today there's a lot of twisting of history, but the God's honest fact of what this story, like this story, tells and makes very clear, that on this day in 1865, 6 Confederate veterans meeting in Pulaski, Tennessee, formed a secret society they called the Ku Klux Klan. Now, who were Confederate veterans? Confederate veterans were Democrats. Okay? And so this is what you got to understand. This is a fact that people, you know, when we look at the transition, history has been twisted. We hear North and South, but it's really not North and South. It's Democrat and Republican. Okay, and when you look at the Democrats, you say, who are the Democrats? The Democrats were the loyalists to the democracy of Britain. Okay, and understand, America is the only nation in this world like it is. We are the only nation. Out amongst in the rest of this world exist democracies. Democracies are controlled by dictators, supreme leaders, superior rulers, demigods, kings, monarchies, okay? We, America, are the only nation in this world as we are. And for the 242 years we have been, those democracies of the world have been trying to destroy us because we're a threat to them. We're a threat to them. Because if people in their country realize that they could be like us, they're going to overthrow the kings, the dictators, the totalitarian rulers, and establish their own independence as we did. They want nothing more, the world, in these countries, these totalitarian regimes and dictatorships around the world of democracies. They want nothing more but to destroy this country so they can revert things back to the way it was. And when you look at one, like you look today, and you say, well, who is allied with the Democratic Party? The Islamic states. Britain, England, all the democracies are allied with the Democratic Party of the world. And the reason why is because they're democracies. and that's what they want. Now, I would like to ask, and considering if you're a black African American, you're not a black African American. You can't be. Africa's a continent. America's a continent. You're as a human being where you are on the land. You're an American. You're a black American. I'm proud to be an American. You should be too. And understand, though, where I'm going with this is you're part of a Democratic Party. Do you understand democracies of a democratic state? The majority rules. Okay? Listen to me here. Just pay attention, and you wonder why you've had these issues all these years. This is what it boils down to. Majority rules in a Democratic Party. The Democratic Party majority is white. Not black. It's white. They just want your vote. They want your vote because your vote does offset the majority of whites in a way where you combine with the white Democrats give them a majority ability to win. They just want your vote. That's all they want. And when you look at your issues and you say to yourself, why has a black man had so many issues? Why has it been so hard for equality? Why are most black people, and then this is true, most black people are in the ghettos. Who controls the ghettos? The Democratic Party. When you show me any ghetto in America, and I'll show you where a Democratic Party is in control. This is a fact going up through the 60s with Lyndon B. Johnson, heading into things with like Margaret Sanger of Planned Parenthood, who wanted to extinct the black race. And these people, the Clintons as well, all of these people, Robert Byrd, these were all, like, it's amazing when you look at modern day history. They try to come off with this past that somewhere in like the 60s there was this party switch between Republicans and Democrats, which is a crock. That's just so idiocy, it's ridiculous. Okay? For one, Lyndon B. Johnson was one of the most racist people you can imagine. And now we know from evidence of things that have been found in relation to recently released documents, which I want to show you here. This is a document that was found recently released, and I'm pretty sure you can see this. I'm going to bring this up full screen for you to see. Democratic Party was this big party switch. Then you have the issue as well where you have like Robert Byrd, who was this Robert Byrd during the time of his runnings. You had here I'm going to bring up Robert Byrd. This is Senator Robert Byrd. Now, this man was said by Hillary Clinton, who is major party to the Democrats. All the Democrats agreed with her. Robert Byrd was a mentor and a hero to the Democratic Party. Robert Byrd was known as what I believe they call a grand poobah. He was like a major recruiter for the Ku Klux Klan. This guy was heavy in the Klan in Virginia. Though he claims he got out of the Ku Klux Klan and he had found his way. Not so much true, though, because the facts of truth kind of distort that. Like I say, LBJ was in the Ku Klux Klan. We know that now. We have evidence of fact of that now, that he was actually a Klan member, and I'm pretty sure Robert Byrd as well was a Klan member. When you look at some of the Democratic Party in this now time, I'm a Republican, I'll tell you right now, I don't support Hillary Clinton, I don't support Robert Byrd, I don't support LBJ. I don't support any of these racist people. I'm trying to watch, I get angry, but these people were the cause, and they're fooling people now. But back to what I'm saying, Democratic Party. Understand, Democrats majority rule. You as black Americans are a minority. Get it? You're a minority. The minority never rules in a democracy. Only the majority. So your voice, though the Democrats tell you, we're listening to you. They are. They're listening to you. They're hearing what you want. They're promising you everything, knowing you're never going to get it. Because for you to get it would take a majority rule. And the majority is not going to rule in your favor in the Democratic Party. They're going to maintain the issues and control over you as they have been doing now for over 60 years. Okay? They're going to maintain that control over you, and they're going to keep promising you things, but you're in a party, the majority rules, and you're the minority. Are you not getting this? You're the minority. Majority before the 1960s, most black Americans were Republicans, because Republicans were founded with Abraham Lincoln. We were the ones who led the charge in the Civil War to end slavery and have it abolished in this country. And, you know, today you have these issues about reparations, this, that, white and black. Well, let me ask you, if all white people are against black people, why did so many white people die to free them in the Civil War? You do understand it wasn't black people who were like, you know what, let's start a civil war and free ourselves. You were freed by a majority of white men who believed in equality for all as Americans. I'm an American. We're one nation of one people. And either you're an American or you're something else. That's it. Either you're an American or you're something else. Because in America, we're one people. Doesn't matter, we don't have color in America. If you love America, you love our principles, our values, our Constitution, our Declaration of Independence, and what we as Americans stand for, you're an American. You have no color. You have no color. And it's up to you to make that common sense decision to understand the Republicans are the Americans. Now, you have the Democratic Party and you have the Republican Party. Again, like I was saying earlier, the biggest mistake ever made in this country was when we allowed the Democrats to come back into our government and allowed them the right to vote, because there was a period after the Civil War they were banned from being in the government and banned from voting. This was the biggest mistake America ever made. And when you, as any American right now, want to understand why we can't be a democracy, our Constitution is established that every state in this union is guaranteed a Republican form of government. Because it is that Republican form of government that honors our Constitution and the amendments to our Constitution, not the Democratic Party. The Democratic Party has been opposed to all the amendments within our Constitution that give equality to Americans. They were opposed to the 13th Amendment, the 14th Amendment, the 15th Amendment, and in truth, even up until Lyndon B. Johnson, they were opposed to the Civil Rights Movement in the 1960s. The only reason they gave into it because they understood they could not win. They could not win. And that's some of the things, too, I want to look at, like here. When you look here at Snoops, this is one of the liberal sites that, you know, they say, you know, you can trust Snoops. Lyndon B. Johnson said back then, I'll have those N-words voting Democrat for 200 years. Is this true or false? They say it's unfounded or unproven. It's unproven. But they do list underneath all the other things, right? Like this right here was stated by him. These Negroes, they're getting pretty uppity these days, and that's a problem for us since they've got something now they never had before. The political pull to back up their uppiness. Now we've got to do something about this. We've got to give them a little something, just enough to quiet them down, not enough to make a difference. For if we don't move at all, then their allies will line up against us, and there'll all be no way of stopping them. We'll lose the filibuster, and there'll be no way of putting a brake on all the sorts of wild legislation. It'll be Reconstruction all over again. Now, I would like to ask every black American, who do you think Lyndon B. Johnson is talking about in this comment that he made as the allies to the black man in America? I'll tell you who. The Republicans. That's who he's talking about. That's exactly who he's talking about. Okay? And when he says you got to give him something, what he gave you was welfare, ghettos. Look at where you're at. Look at Chicago. Look at like the ghetto areas of Los Angeles. Look at like Newark, New Jersey. Look at the Brooklyn, Bronx. These heavy minority areas, where for the majority are black population, are controlled by Democrats, are all ghettos. Now, this is what the Democratic Party has to offer to you, and you keep saying, you know, well, we want better, we want this, and they keep telling you, yeah, you're going to get that. But do you not realize they're Democrat? They want democracy. That's what they tried to form in the Civil War. That's what they still want now. That's all you hear now out of everybody's mouth. Our democracy, America is not a democracy. Look up Article 4, Section 4 of the United States Constitution. It makes very clear every state in this union is guaranteed a Republican form of government. Democracy, Democrat, mentioned nowhere, anywhere in the Declaration of Independence or the United States Constitution or any of its amendments. It's not mentioned anywhere. There is no democracy or democratic establishment in America. We're a republic. And in a republic, this is what you have to understand as black Americans. In a republic, under our form of government, the minority has a voice. The minority has a right under the law that's protected by the United States Constitution, not the Democratic Confederate State Constitution. The United States Constitution guarantees every individual equal protection of the law and the rights of each and every American to be equally applied. That's under a republic. If you're a minority or you're a majority, it doesn't matter. If you're all white, it doesn't matter. If you're a minority black, it doesn't matter, because the minority, the individual, has his rights and equal to all. Under a democracy, your rights are only given to you when you're the majority. And in America, you only make up about 1/3 of the population of the whole entire nation. You only make up about 30% of the Democratic Party, because the majority of them are racist, and you don't even realize how trapped you are, how weaved you are under their control. Look at these people. And when you see people like Elijah Cummings, Farrakhan, these guys are the worst Uncle Toms out there, I'll tell you right now. When I look at these people, especially Farrakhan, how he lies to these people, he doesn't even tell them the truth of that, you know. And when you look back at like Malcolm X was becoming awoken to the truth. He was starting to figure it out. That's why they killed him, because he started to figure out that they were just using the black people, the Democratic Party, and Islam for their mutual goal. Because mind you, when you look today and you realize, who are their allies? How come they're so friendly with the Islamic states? Who do you think sold them most of their slaves during the founding of this country? Who do you think was importing the slaves to the democratic southern states? The Islamic states. They had trade agreement with them then for slavery. Slavery is still allowed in those states now. What do you think the end game's going to be if the Democratic Party and the Islamic State gets what they want? What do you think the end result would be if they were able to actually ever throw, which they're not going to do? They'll never throw this republic over. They'll never do it. But you know what? We can further prevent that as Americans. One people. One people. Use common sense. Just use common sense. I mean, when you look at some of the things like here with Robert Byrd, there's another thing I want to point out that talks about with Robert Byrd here. There was an instant of casual racism that can't be so easily recognized. Biographer Carl also notes that Johnson is said to have replied as follows to a black chauffeur who told him he preferred to be called by name instead of boy, the N-word, or chief. And Johnson replied to him, as long as you are black, you're going to be black till the day you die. No one's going to call you by your goddamn name. So no matter what you called, N-word, you just let it roll off your back like water, and you'll make it. Just pretend you're a goddamn piece of furniture. This is the guy who you, as the black American Democrat, believe gave you your rights. This is the guy. Are you kidding me? Now we're going to take a look here a little bit further. Let's take a look at what your main head thought of Robert Byrd. Robert Byrd, mind you, was a grand poobah. He was a major recruiter for the Ku Klux Klan.
Today our country has lost a true American original, my friend and mentor Robert C. Byrd. Senator Byrd was a man of surpassing eloquence and nobility. And I will remember him for many things, but most of all, for a heartfelt comment he made to me in the dark days following the attack on our country on 9/11. My state of New York was reeling, and we were scrambling to provide support and relief. Think of me as the third senator from New York, he said, and he meant it. Thanks to the leadership of Senator Byrd, who chaired the Appropriations Committee, New Yorkers and Americans got the help we needed.
So as you can see here, Hillary Clinton praises Robert Byrd, a former grand poobah. And the funny thing about how they try to excuse things and they downplay things, I mean, it just amazes me when you look at how many Ku Klux Klan members are in the Democratic Party, how many of them are in political government, and how these are the very people you as black Americans have to pander to get what you want. In a democratic democracy, and where the majority rules and you're a minority and you think you're going to get what you want, you're the minority. In a Democratic Party, you don't matter. Don't you get this? You don't matter. In a Republican Party, you matter, because the individual, the minority, matters in a Republican. In a democracy, the majority rules, not the minority. And your pleas, your cries, your outcries, and you have legitimate. I get it. The areas that you guys are forced in and the things that have happened are atrocious and they're rotten. But as a Republican, I sit back and I keep saying to myself, why do you do it to yourself? Why? You're in the party that's doing this to you. All of the communities that are the majority of black communities are governed by who? The Democrats. How can you blame Republicans? We're not even allowed to come in there and say anything. You won't even listen to us. You don't even give us the time of day. We're not the ones governing those areas. We're not the ones governing Chicago. We're not the ones governing the heavy ghetto areas. The Democrats are. They're the ones suppressing you. They're the ones holding you down, not us. And you're there and you're pleading to these people, expecting them to give you something, and you don't even realize your pleas are falling on deaf ears. You're a minority. It's the Democratic Party of a democracy, and the majority rules, not the minority. So your pleas are falling on deaf ears. Don't you get this? You're never going to get what you want in a majority rule party as a minority. This is common sense. This is why it's been dragging on so long. Since, I mean, we were making good progress up until the 40s and 50s on the Republican side till you were able to be fooled and go to the Democratic side. Now in the Democratic side, you've trapped yourself in your own jail as a minority under a majority rule form of government, of a democracy, in a Democratic Party. The majority rules. That majority is governing you. That majority is your party's government leaders. And they're all, for the majority, white. White, racist, no good, evil, sick people who have been doing nothing but dividing this country since the days of the Loyalists, when they were with the democracy of Britain, to when they formed a Democratic Party in 1826, to when they divided this nation in the Civil War, to when they opposed the 13th, 14th, 15th Amendment. They were opposed all Civil Rights Acts, all the way up, formed the Ku Klux Klan, the Jim Crow laws. What is it that you don't see? Again, let's take further look and debate about, like you want to see. This is a conversation between Robert Byrd, former Ku Klux Klan member, and Lyndon B. Johnson. Let's just take a quick listen to, I want to skip ahead here just to the point of,
Bob, you tell Larry that and tell him to try to get in touch with Wilbur Coyne, and I'll be talking to him later and see what my experts recommend. I don't know anything about the amendment or the merits. I haven't gone into any of it in this bill. I haven't talked to him yet. All I know is I love you, and you're just cooking up so damn much business. I didn't know you were that young and active. I thought that you got your license practice law, that you just quit rewriting all the laws and sit down and kind of whittle and love your friends. But every time I pick up paper, you have some other victory of some kind. I'm going to have to draft you and get you to come down here and help me win something. Well, what about my housing? Is it going to pass all right? Don't you let them touch it.
Okay, I just want you to know, that's Lyndon B. Johnson on the phone with Robert Byrd, both members of the Virginia Ku Klux Klan. Okay, both members. Robert Byrd was a Ku Klux Klan grand recruiter, and now we know from FBI files that Lyndon B. Johnson himself was part of the branch of the Virginia Ku Klux Klan. So these are two people during the time of the 1960s civil rights movement. One's president, the other one's a senator, and they are in control of the legislation to what's going to be the civil rights. Following the Civil Rights Act, then what happened to black Americans? Let me ask you. What happened? What happened? You all wound up in ghettos, like jails, like big city community prisons. where you were dependent upon welfare, where you were pushed in, offered all this free stuff that wound up being what you get for free in America. You get the minimum that life will afford you for free. That's what they give you. And they keep you suppressed there, and they keep you undereducated, and they keep you uninformed, because as long as they keep you there, they got you where they want you, and they've always had you. And right now, when you look at what's going on, it's just astonishing. I want to share another video that shows what Bill Clinton, this is like incredibly hilarious when you hear him, how he covers for Robert Byrd being in the Ku Klux Klan. I just want to play this for you, and I want you to hear this. I'm just hoping that it wakes some people up.
There are a lot of people who wrote these eulogies for Senator Byrd in the newspapers, and I read a bunch of them, and they mentioned that he once had a fleeting association with the Ku Klux Klan. And what does that mean? I'll tell you what it means. He was a country boy from the hills and hollows of West Virginia. He was trying to get elected. And maybe he did something he shouldn't have done, and he spent the rest of his life making it up. And that's what a good person does. There are no perfect people. There are certainly no perfect politicians. I admired.
So as you can see right here, he's admitting about the Ku Klux Klan. Hillary Clinton calls this guy her mentor and hero. Many of the Democratic leaders call him their mentor and hero. All of them refer back to Lyndon B. Johnson. And like I say, we can go back and we can review some other things like with Lyndon B. Johnson. I want to go back here and see the one where it was... find it, the example of... well, if you want, you can read all these things. They're at the bottom of the Snoop's unproven statement of, did he say he would have the N-words voting Democrat for 200 years, which clearly it appears the man was able to get what he wanted. But my point is this. If you want reparations, well, your reparations goes back to the Democratic Party of the democracy of the loyalists to Britain and the Islamic states, not the United States. The United States 242 years new. We ended slavery. We ended slavery with thousands and thousands of white American men's lives fighting to make everybody equal in this country. Since the Civil War, we have done all we can to establish a constitution of law to protect those rights for all Americans. And today, many black and white Americans are united. And we plan on staying united as that one people. And we're going to stay the republic of these United States. And we don't owe anybody anything. You understand? We don't owe anybody anything. And when you look at the suppression and the issues of the ghettos and the hardship that black Americans have faced being members of the Democratic Party, if you want to look at blame, you go to a mirror and you look in that mirror. And in a way, it's sad. It's very sad, because I can't really say that, because you have been under Democratic authority and rule. Your education systems have failed to where you had no opportunity to know the truth. You had no ability. When you look at education today, I mean, it's incredible. Like I said, a couple months ago, or last year, I remember watching a video a guy did at college, and he asked a black American girl at this college who was in her second year of law, when was the Civil War? And she said 1965. When he asked her if Abraham Lincoln was a Republican or a Democrat, she said he was a Democrat. So this is a second-year law student in college. Okay, so I understand that. And then too, when you look at the school systems, they're geared in the Democratic-controlled areas. They're more like prep school for prison. I mean, these schools have metal detectors, barbed wire around them, fences around them. They look like prisons. And this is what you're getting by the party you support. And you're doing this as a minority. This is what I'm asking you, the black American, because I'm a Republican. I'm an American. My grandkids got to grow up in this country. Okay? And throughout my family, we have black Americans and we have white Americans. And we get along fine. I grew up myself in Newark, New Jersey. I got no problem with black people. Okay? I don't care to refer to anybody by black or white. I mean, I'm not stupid. I know there's a difference. You're black, I'm white. That doesn't really mean anything. The reason why we're different is all due to our natural ability to adapt to an environment. It has nothing to do with who we are as people. And that's what the issue comes down to. Who are the people? Because there's black racists, there's white racists. There's black people hate white people, there's white people hate black people. But in this country, the issue of division lies really with the majority of those white people who really hate black people, have always hated black people, have been doing all they can to retain control over black people, and that's the Democrats. Okay? That's the Democrats. You're a part of a party, of a democracy, of a democratic establishment where the majority rules, and you as the black American are the minority. In the Republican Party, it is the individual who has the rights. Everyone, as an individual, is equally protected by the laws of this country. We lose this republic, you need to ask yourself, where are you going to be? Because under a democracy, the majority rules. And that majority right now is allied with one of the world's only still slave trading nations, the Islamic nation. What do you think the outcome's going to be? So I would ask you all to take some time, consider the truth of facts, and understand the United States of America owes nobody nothing. Nothing. We don't owe retribution to anybody. You want retributions? If you feel your ignorance feels that you are entitled to retributions, well, you know, and it's an ignorant statement to say, because like I say, you trapped yourself in this own ignorance. You deprived yourself by trapping yourself there in your own ignorance of education and understanding of the truth of these matters. But you did it to yourself. For the last 60 years, you've been doing it to yourself. Matter of fact, since the Civil War, you've been doing it to yourself. These people come and offer you free handouts. And you reach for the easy reach, and it puts you in the hardship. It puts you in a place where no matter how much you cry, no matter how much you claim your hardship is, you're not being heard because you're a minority and you're part of a Democratic Party where the majority rules. Understand, the Democratic Party favors democracy, a majority rule. You're a minority crying to a party that only listens to a majority. I just don't get how you don't understand this. If you were to look at Republican principles, you understand every individual, one person, one man, me or you, me as a white man or you as a black man in a Republican Party, if we own our house and the law says we have a right to have the whole nation can vote and say we want to take that man's house, but the law protects us equally as one, no one can take our damn house. No one can take our property. No one can treat us any different under the law. If we go into a court, either me or you as a white man or a black man, under Republican system, and a white man let's say you punch somebody in the face, and last week a white man punched somebody in the face and the judge released him. That's the precedence of law. Either one of us should be able to walk in that courtroom and raise that case and say we should be released if we punch somebody in the face. And equally under the rights of the law, we should be protected. But you seem to fail to understand that the law within the Democratic Party only applies to majority. And even within the Democratic Party itself, you're only a 30% minority. Your voice does not matter. The 70% of the white racists that run the Democratic Party is what matters. They're the voice heard. And they're just appeasing you and telling you what you want to hear, promising you things that you as well should be by now. I mean, since the Civil War up until now, what have they really given you that they said they would give you? Name one thing that you got that was promised you. Nothing. Why? Because you're a minority. And the majority, after they got you trapped in, after they got you voting for them and you gave them the upper hand as a majority to be able to dominate certain states and get the Senate and the House, well, they don't need you anymore. That's all they need you for. They just need you at voting time. Because at voting time, you help them tip the scales. That's it. And being that as a minority, you have more attention towards you as being more lenient to giving you, supposedly giving you more. Democrats don't give you nothing. I can't believe this. You know, you're in a party that was of friggin', you know, you had with Planned Parenthood. Okay, these people want to extinct you. You got Jim Crow, who was in the Jim Crow laws, the Ku Klux Klan, all founded by the Democratic Party. Lyndon B. Johnson, your claimed hero, is now confirmed by FBI records of what they know to be a fact, was actually a member of the Virginia Ku Klux Klan, the same Virginia Ku Klux Klan that Robert Byrd was a member of. And in Arkansas, they know Bill Clinton was associated with the Ku Klux. These are your leaders. And you're trusting these people, really. And you know what? Yeah, they can, look, if I was a Democratic racist and you come to me and you say you want equality, I'll be like, oh, I'll give it to you. I'll give it to you. When it comes to the floor or a vote, you're gonna be all right. How are you gonna get that in a democracy of a Democratic vote when the majority rules and you're only 30%? You're never gonna get a damn thing. You're never gonna get a damn thing because you're a minority in a majority rule party. Think about that. That's about all I got to say for today. This is all I want for people to consider in relation to this. And like I say, you know, I hope everyone has a good time with this. You know, do your own research. Wake up, America. Wake up. Because our problems, you know, my grandkids got to grow up, and I just don't like what's going on. I want it fixed. But, you know, have a blast with it all. I hope everybody has a great weekend and you know, enjoy this video. Do some research, please, and look into it. Thank you all.